Good morning. My name is Joyce Penner, and I am the outgoing president of the Atmospheric Sciences section. And I have the honor of introducing our very first Future Horizons in Climate Science Turco Lectureship, which was established through a very kind donation by Richard and Linda Turco, and highlights climate change. The lecture this morning is awarded to Jennifer Kay, or Jen, and she has an area of research. Well, her area of research is polar processes and related issues related to climate change in polar regions. She is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, and we are very honored to have her speak to us this morning. Help me welcome Jennifer Kay.
Thank you. It's quite an honor to give this lecture. Thank you, Turco. That's really awesome. My lecture this morning, Advancing Polar Science as the World Warms. The background picture here is a picture I took off the coast of Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, Alaska, of some very thin first-year sea ice. I was off the coast surveying sea ice with some friends, and we came across this very thin ice, and we almost fell through. This thin ice is a symptom of our warming climate, and I'm especially excited to tell you how I think we've learned a lot as the sea ice has thinned and as the world has warmed. So for those who haven't been keeping track of what's going on in the Arctic, it's quite incredible. Since the late 1970s, when we first had passive microwave remote sensing to tell us where the sea ice exists, where the ocean is frozen in the northern pole, we've seen a decline of the Arctic sea ice, and this decline has really prompted all kinds of questions. Why is this happening? What is going on? Is this climate change? Is this just natural variability? The changes here are so pronounced and so far beyond anything that we've seen in thousands and thousands of years that it's really clear here the influence of increased greenhouse gases on our atmosphere is playing a role. But what are the relative contributions of both the forced climate change from increasing greenhouse gases and just the variability that exists in the system? Now this time series is for September, when the Arctic sea ice reaches its seasonal minimum, but you can see loss in all months of the year in the Arctic. Here I just have an image of the September 2012 Arctic sea ice cover. This is the lowest Arctic sea ice extent on record. It was possible to circumnavigate the North Pole, the Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea Route, fully open. These are things that when I was a kid, I would read books about, and the early explorers were totally challenged at navigating these waters, which are now open. This has all kinds of consequences in the Arctic. For example, Russia, which is pictured here, more than 10% of the Russian economy is in the Arctic. There are all kinds of geopolitical, economic, environmental issues that are emerging in the Arctic as we're losing the sea ice. It's important to recognize that this Arctic sea ice loss, and also greater than global Arctic warming, was actually predicted decades ago. A seminal paper by Manabe and Stouffer in 1980, the CO2-induced warming of the surface air is particularly large in high latitudes. Here he is making some plots. I'm pretty sure that the plots that he's showing in this picture took a lot more energy than the plots that I'm showing in my talk today. He and his team were working with a supercomputer in the 1970s. Their supercomputer had about 0.5 megabyte of memory. The images on this slide contain more memory than he was making these amazing discoveries, and all of his colleagues and other folks at the time, it's not just Manabe and Stouffer, They really saw evidence for the Arctic warming more than the lower latitudes. And this was in response to very classic feedback, such as the surface albedo feedback, in which during the summer in the Arctic, you lose the Arctic sea ice that enhances the absorption of sunlight, and then that further melts the sea ice. And that warming at the surface is something that actually doesn't occur in the summer, but is seasonally delayed. Because during the summer, what's happening is the heat is accumulating in the surface ocean, and then eventually it comes back up into the lower atmosphere, driving another important positive feedback in the Arctic, the lapse rate feedback. So these two feedbacks, well, we'll hear about them more in this lecture, but I want to emphasize that they were in very early climate models, and that these models had all of that physics with very, very non-big data resources. So today, we have so many more resources to work with. We have observations, we have models. One model that you'll hear about through this talk, so I wanted to introduce it here, is the Community Earth System model. At its core, it's very similar to the model used by Manabe and Stouffer. It's a coupled ocean, atmosphere, land, sea ice model. There's an additional component that we now have, a land ice model. I have some statistics here about this model. One thing I want to particularly emphasize in this talk is that it can replicate things that we see. It can replicate phenomena that are important for coupled variability, such as El Nino and La Nina, and it can also replicate observed Arctic sea ice loss. So here's an example. We have the observations in red, a single climate model simulation in black, and we can see this pronounced Arctic sea ice loss in September is well captured by the model. And it projects that by the middle part of this century, we will be seasonally ice-free. I also want to emphasize that this observed record is about the same age as I am. And so this change has happened over my lifetime. So here I am in October 2006 at my PhD defense. At the top is Professor Marcia Baker, who is my advisor. At the bottom, my family came to support me. Marcia gave me a pink feather boa. She said she usually gave her male graduate students ties, but for me, she was going to go pink feather boa, and that I should wear it to my first meeting with my postdoctoral supervisor. At the time, I was fascinated with science and the explosion of things that were available and of interest at the University of Washington. I want to particularly highlight that although my PhD research did not focus on the Arctic, I was very interested in those topics at that time. I was talking with Steve Warren at the cryospheric reception and remembered that his formation of snow and ice masses class, I enjoyed it so much that I took it twice. I don't have any students who want to take my class twice. But it was really when I started my postdoc and really transitioned away from my PhD research that my interests in the polar regions were really found. They were found through really new data, and there were a couple of satellites that were launched that really launched my career. This is the CloudSat and Calypso, spaceborne radar and LiDAR to look at the vertical structure of clouds and precipitation in the atmosphere. Launched at 6 a.m., April 28th, 2006. It was right before I finished my PhD. I applied to work with these data with Professor Graham Stevens and Dr. Andrew Gettleman. Their ad read, "We seek a postdoctoral fellow to conduct analyses of cloud and precipitation processes in models and observations with a focus on CloudSat and global models, and in particular the CESM." The first years of CloudSat and Calypso were very exciting. There were a lot of discoveries being made. One that I'm particularly proud of, and particularly proud of my role in it, was understanding how clouds contribute to extreme Arctic sea ice loss. These are the data from the first 2 years in the summer over the Arctic, in a region where there had been a lot of Arctic sea ice loss. What we're looking at here is the vertical structure of the clouds. And what you can see is poleward of about 70 degrees north, there was a precipitous drop in the amount of cloud cover in 2007. 2007 was also a remarkable record minimum in Arctic sea ice loss. Here I just show the circulation pattern and also the Arctic sea ice extent cover during that year. There was a strong Beaufort high, large sea level pressure gradients. These drove all kinds of processes, winds that pushed the ice, warm air advection from lower latitudes, and in addition, these drops in cloud cover. The cloud reductions associated with this circulation pattern contributed to the extreme 2007 Arctic sea ice loss because they enabled the surface albedo feedback to be stronger. In fact, these cloud reductions occurred early in the melt season, which enabled the strong surface albedo feedback to kickstart this season and contribute to this extreme minimum in Arctic sea ice loss. So we published a paper on it, and one of the take-homes from that paper was that in a warmer world with thinner ice, natural summertime circulation and cloud variability is an increasingly important control on Arctic sea ice extent. In effect, we had seen these patterns before, we had seen low cloud cover before, but the impact on the sea ice had not been nearly as pronounced. So it was this long-term thinning of the ice combined with circulation variability that's largely probably due to just the chaotic nature of the atmosphere itself that led to this pronounced minimum. The discoveries didn't stop there. I really like this quote by Jack Oliver, who's a professor emeritus at Cornell University. Scientific discoveries occur when one can associate oneself with new observations of what appear to be prominent yet unexplored or poorly understood features of Earth. Jack Oliver was a geologist, and he was making observations and putting them together to understand the theories of plate tectonics. I cannot emphasize more strongly how much this quote applies to so much of what we do in science. CloudSat and Calypso, these new data, combined with a changing Arctic environment, has really been such a fertile ground to understand processes in the Arctic. And when combined with models, that dialogue back and forth between models and observations really enables discovery. So another discovery. Increased absorbed shortwave radiation associated with summer sea ice loss. So here I have two maps. They show trends over 15-year periods. They show where we've had more absorbed sunshine into the surface Arctic Ocean during the summer and where we've lost Arctic sea ice. And you see a pronounced spatial correspondence between the two. Now, for those who don't think about clouds, this may not be that surprising, but much of the world's ocean is covered with cloud. And in fact, if the clouds had formed as the ice was lost, we would have replaced one bright surface, the ice, with another, clouds, and we never would have seen these increases in absorbed shortwave radiation that are so important for driving greater than global Arctic warming. So this discovery is consistent with the lack of a summer cloud response to summer Arctic sea ice loss. And it's consistent with a hypothesis that we put forward, an air-sea coupling hypothesis. This hypothesis is that there is no cloud response to summer sea ice loss, but that we anticipate cloud increases over newly opened water during early fall, and in fact during all non-summer seasons. And this arises because during the summer in the Arctic, the air in the atmosphere is relatively warm, and the surface is constrained near the melting temperature, so you still have a relatively stable situation in the Arctic. In contrast, in the non-summer months, if you have open water, it is a lot warmer than the air that overlies it, and that can drive large fluxes of heat and moisture from the open ocean into the lower atmosphere and cloud formation, as is pictured here on the bottom for September 30th, 2007. So we're going to fast forward in time. This is now Dr. Ariel Morrison. She graduated, defended this last week. She's the third Ph.D. student to defend in my group this year. It's been an incredible year in the K group. Here she is pictured outside of Boulangerie in Paris. She spent time in Paris as a part of the Chateaubriand Fellowship from the Embassy of France. And the transition here is not only to talk about her research, which has really taken this influence of clouds and sea ice to another level, but also to emphasize the importance of international collaboration. The French and my experiences in France have been very formative, and it's really incredible to see Ariel also taking advantage of these opportunities. It's one way that I think we advance science as the world warms. We work together. So these are figures from Ariel's paper published this year in JGR. She's looking at the profiles of clouds over open water and over sea ice. And what she's found is that the observations show a small impact of cloud sea ice feedbacks on observed warming. So how has she found this? Well, first, she was very careful in defining where to look. She only looked over the intermittent mask. This is a region in the Arctic where you intermittently have sea ice or have open water. And that's important because by looking in this region, you can see where sea ice varies, and then you can look at profiles over open water and over sea ice and see if they look different. And if you do this at an instantaneous time scale, you can average over all of the weather noise and end up with a signature of what the surface does to cloud profiles. So what you see on the left is that during the summer, the cloud profiles over open water and over sea ice look almost the same. And this is consistent with this air-sea coupling hypothesis that I described. In contrast, in the fall, there's more low-level clouds over open water than over sea ice, again consistent with the air-sea coupling hypothesis. So there's no evidence for a summer cloud sea ice feedback. We're not going to be saved by increased cloud cover over the sea ice that we're losing in the summer. The surface albedo feedback will go on. In the fall, the increases have a small feedback because there's competing effects between the short wave and the long wave, and they compensate pretty well in the fall. But as we move into the future, these increases will occur later and later in the season and could potentially be a larger cloud feedback. Ariel went further. She analyzed in the same way these processes in CESM, the climate model. She found that CESM is a reasonable match to the observations. It shows no change in the summer cloud profiles associated with this change in the surface cover. And then she also saw that there were more clouds over open water than over sea ice. And for sure, climate models have all kinds of problems. This model in particular has insufficient supercooled liquid in it, all kinds of problems. But with this, we have a simple hypothesis for how the processes are controlling the clouds, and it's really remarkable that the model is actually able to reproduce this. So it gives us some confidence for using this model to look into the future, which is, of course, one of the things that models enable us to do. When Ariel did this, what she saw were small 21st century cloud feedbacks in the Arctic. They're weakly positive. So much smaller than, for example, the large positive surface albedo feedback and the corresponding then lapse rate feedback. So this small cloud feedback is due to this lack of a cloud response to sea ice loss during the summer, but again, may be underestimated in the non-summer months because CESM does have some important biases. It has insufficient supercooled liquid within the mixed phase clouds, as has been pointed out in a number of studies. So this interplay between models and observations, I think, is giving us a good handle of what we might expect from Arctic cloud feedbacks in the future. And it's really only by going back and forth between the observations and the models that we can make these statements. So this idea that model cloud feedbacks are small and that maybe they're uncertain in models is actually well seen in other models as well, without a detailed understanding of the cloud sea ice feedbacks in them. But this figure from Python et al., 2014, it really tries to diagnose what the warming contribution of different feedbacks are in the Arctic. And modeled cloud feedbacks across many different models, not just the CESM, is uncertain, but relatively small contribution to total warming. In fact, it is this interconnected surface albedo feedback and positive lapse rate feedback that really explain the Arctic warming. I want to emphasize, and I admit I have a bias, I'm kind of a cloud person, but it's not just the Arctic cloud feedbacks that matter, it's the cloud influence on the other feedbacks. Clouds influence the albedo feedback, they influence the lapse rate feedback. So I have a very cloud-centric view of Arctic warming, and I always like to think about extremes. This is something I learned from Jim Head, who is a professor at Brown, who, when thinking about problems, always emphasized the importance of the end members. So the end members here are no clouds and very, very, very thick cloud. So with no clouds, you have a very strong positive surface albedo feedback in the Arctic, because any sunlight that comes in is just immediately contributing to that positive feedback process. Then you have a lot of absorbed shortwave radiation, a lot of absorbed sunlight in the ocean, and that all comes back out to the lower atmosphere in the fall and later, driving a very positive lapse rate feedback. Let's contrast that with the other end member, that you have clouds that are so thick that there's very little penetration of shortwave radiation to the surface. You basically severely handicap the positive surface albedo feedback and then the resulting lapse rate feedback. So clouds, they don't play a role necessarily through their feedbacks on the system, but instead in their regulation and control of other feedbacks. So I want to return back to the beginning of the talk and some of the things that I outlined there. Why has Arctic sea ice declined, and what can we expect in the future? Prediction is a very difficult thing to do. I always show this in my intro level class. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future, just to emphasize how remarkable some of the early predictions of global warming and greater than global Arctic warming have been. I also really like this quote, "Uncertainty is not ignorance." This is something Carrie Emanuel said when talking about hurricanes and climate change, and I think it's really important because as scientists, often when we discuss our uncertainties, it gets perceived as ignorance, even though we know there's some things that we really don't control, and we're uncertain about, therefore. There's 3 sources of uncertainty for climate projections. The first is internal climate variability uncertainty. This uncertainty arises from unforced climate variability intrinsic to a given climate state. And it is uncertainty that is irreducible. It's uncertainty we cannot reduce. It's the same uncertainty that we face when we try to make a weather prediction for a year from now. That's just not possible. And it's not because we're ignorant, it's because the atmosphere is chaotic and unpredictable on those timescales. The second source of uncertainty is forcing uncertainty or scenario uncertainty. So uncertainty from changes in the forcing due to, in large part these days, human decisions, emissions of greenhouse gases, aerosols, etc. It really matters if we go to 500 or 1,000 parts per million CO2 equivalent. And that decision will be made by people all over the world. It's not really in the purview of science to figure it out. It's all of us working together to understand what kind of future we want on this planet. The last is the physical process uncertainty, and I'm pretty sure that this is 99% of the time what people think when you say you're uncertain as a scientist. So we can reduce this uncertainty. We reduce this uncertainty by improving our understanding and modeling of the physical processes and feedbacks, and then making better projections. So all 3 of these sources of uncertainty are important. The internal climate variability is something that's especially important on short lead times and in small spatial domains, and is one that I think we have an increasing recognition and should be increasingly humble of. So I'm going to discuss these different sources of uncertainty in the context of Arctic sea ice loss. So there was a concern raised in 2007, around that time, that Arctic sea ice decline was faster than predicted by climate models. This faster than forecast was ubiquitous. You would hear it everywhere. Here is sort of the canonical figure from it. We have Arctic sea ice loss when the models in blue with a standard deviation around them, and then in red, the observations. I added 2007 on here so you can see it's well outside of the standard deviation across models. And there were all kinds of concerns raised about the utility of models and whether or not they could be used to predict the future if they couldn't even reproduce this observed Arctic sea ice loss. There were concerns about the mean state of the models. Maybe the sea ice was too thick in these models, and that was really the problem, because if the sea ice is too thick, it's just a geometric problem, right? You're not going to melt enough ice if it's too thick. So this concern about the mean state was interesting because at the time I was working at NCAR with colleagues there, and we were finding that it was possible to make simulations with climate models that compared reasonably well with available observations. So we were able, for example, with these two different variants of the CESM, to see that we could reproduce the observed seasonal cycle in sea ice loss, sea ice extent, and that also, importantly, we could replicate the sea ice thickness distribution. So there were relatively new observations coming online at that time from ISAT, which is shown in the bottom left. And then you can see that the thickest sea ice really lives north of Canada, and then it tapers off to much thinner ice as you head towards Russia. And we had similar types of patterns with not all that unrealistic sea ice thicknesses. And again, these are short records, and so it's sometimes hard to compare between these short 2 or 3 year records, especially in a time of such pronounced ice loss. So this ubiquitous discussion of faster than forecasts, reflecting these severe model physics deficiencies, and my own experiences in climate model development, led to writing a paper. And I want to particularly call out the importance of attending scientific meetings and being critical and thinking while you're at them. This paper was written in direct response almost to some statements that were being made by the co-chair of the IPCC AR5, who was sort of repeating these statements that were coming out. Faster than forecast, models can't do this, and it was totally different than what I was seeing on the ground. So we wrote this paper, Interannual to Multi-Decadal Arctic Sea Ice Extent Trends in a Warming World. And in this paper, we showed that climate models can qualitatively reproduce observed Arctic sea ice loss, but they have large internal climate variability. So these postage stamps that are shown here, they show the trends as a function of month of the year on the Y, and then the trend end year, so we're just adding more years. I know you can't read the years, but the only thing that's really important here is that they're all blue if you look at the observations. And if you look here, we have 6 different realizations that differ only because of their internal climate variability. And you can see the model, for example, on the upper left, does a reasonable job of reproducing this Arctic sea ice loss in all months of the year. But another ensemble member with the same physics, the same forcing, is basically getting next to no Arctic sea ice loss, showing the influence of this large internal climate variability on our observed trends. We asked very simple questions in this paper. Can Arctic sea ice extent increase in a warming world? The answer was most definitely yes. Even on a 10-year time scale, about half of the trends were increasing. Of course, when you start to get to longer trends, 20, 30 years, you have much stronger trends, and they become more definitely declining, positive trends. But on a 10-year time scale, to think that you would have increases in Arctic sea ice extent, that was really shocking to many. So that leads me to a question that I have for all of you. What do 21st century Arctic sea ice projections and Guns N' Roses have in common? Any idea? This came from some of the press coverage of our paper. Arctic sea ice could make a comeback tour, right? The summer's ice coverage could hold its ground or even bounce back slightly, even as global average temperatures rise. But like a Guns N' Roses tour, the comeback will be short-lived and eventually doomed to disappear. Pretty good. I mean, I was really impressed. I never talked to this reporter, but they really got it. So there were 3 key points from this GRL paper that we published. The first, large ensembles from credible models are needed to understand sea ice trends. It was clear that with these 6 members, there was a large variety in the trends that one might see over the observed record, and we needed more to really understand what was happening. Second, the implication of what we were seeing then was that Arctic sea ice loss has been enhanced by internal variability. And finally, that when internal variability masks anthropogenic forcing, positive trends occur. In other words, the internal variability can overwhelm the signal that we're getting from increased greenhouse gases and lead to temporary increases in the sea ice. So this interest in large ensembles was not just an interest of mine at NCAR at that time, at the National Center. We were discussing large ensembles, and in particular, the need to involve a community in their analysis. And so born out of that was the Community Earth System Large Ensemble Project, which is a community resource for studying climate change in the presence of internal climate variability. And there are a whole cast of characters that were involved with this. Clara Desser, who's a senior scientist at NCAR, and I co-led this project. So here's the experimental design. So what we do is we run an 1850 control run. So this is basically living perpetually in 1850 with constant 1850 forcing. Then we launch our first ensemble member, and we run from 1850 all the way through 2100. Over the historical period, we used the known climate forcings. Into the future, we used a business-as-usual scenario that got us to about 1,000 parts per million CO2 equivalent by the end of this century. Then the novelty of this project comes. We went back to 1920, and we reran 1920 to 2100 many, many times. The difference between all of these different ensemble members was very small. In fact, at the beginning, it's barely perceptible. It's at the round-off level, the precision level of the computer. If you look at how the global mean temperature evolves in the very first days of this experiment, the large ensemble, you can see how it transitions from deterministic weather to chaotic climate. So here, the global mean temperature, all the ensemble members track each other quite well for the first 10 to 15 days. There you're seeing the predictability of the atmosphere. This is what enables us to do weather prediction. At some point in time, the members start to really diverge from each other. The chaotic nature of the atmosphere expresses itself. And the differences between these members, again, arises solely from the internal climate variability in the system. So many people were needed to make this project possible. Many of them are pictured here. I want to particularly call out the contributions of Marika Holland, a scientist at NCAR who was also the chief scientist of the CESM at the time, who was very supportive of the project and helped us obtain many of the resources that we needed. This was a big data project. We produced hundreds of terabytes of outputs, and analyzing and figuring out if we were doing the right thing before we released this to a huge community of people to look at and use for their own research was a very big challenge. I want to also acknowledge Gary Strand, who's pictured in the middle there. Gary is a data scientist, and Gary really was so important to this project. A single example of something that Gary did during this project: we were saving the outputs from the model in a certain NetCDF format, and Gary said, oh, well, why don't we use this NetCDF format instead? And our project went from a petabyte to 500 terabytes. So those kinds of things are so important when you're thinking about a project like this. You need people of all different kinds and all different expertise to make a project like this happen. And this project has really taken off. I'm blown away by how many people are using it. It's been cited over 500 times. It serves as a foundation for so many angles in research. It's a hot paper, apparently. I keep getting emails from the science citation people. They tell me it's the hottest paper in all of geoscience. I was like, whoa, okay, that's great. Some examples of research using this large ensemble, looking at risks of drought, for example, in California. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, these modes of internal climate variability and understanding how they work. There's so many papers, so many projects, there's no way I could possibly describe all of the things that have happened with this, but it's so extremely gratifying to see it succeed. Some results that I think are important, especially to communicate: the internal climate variability can overwhelm the forced response. So here, this is just 4 panels. They're showing surface air temperature trends in winter over 79 to 2012, so 34 years. This is adapted from our description paper of the project. On the upper left, you have the ensemble mean response. So you average over all of the different ensemble members, and by doing so, reduce the internal climate variability and really bring out the forced response. So you can see the greater than global Arctic warming. You can see more warming over land than over the ocean, things that are consistent with our understanding of some of the physical processes at hand. On the right, on the top, are the observations. And I want to make it really clear that it is inappropriate to compare the observations to the ensemble mean. The observations are one observed reality. And to make that point clear, I'll show two members on the bottom, members 13 and 14. And since we're in Washington, D.C., I thought this would be an interesting comparison to make. So member 13, if you look on the east coast of the US, you can see pronounced cooling trends over this time period. In member 14, pronounced warming trends. Here we're seeing the internal climate variability overwhelming the forced response, which is shown on the upper left. The mid-latitudes especially have a lot of variability associated with internal climate variability, primarily in the atmosphere. And this makes the detection and attribution of trends in these regions hard, even on these 30-year plus timescales. The internal climate variability can overwhelm the forced response. I also want to be clear that internal variability is really not a big signature on the late 21st century warming. If you go to 1,000 parts per million, you look at trends over this century, this is all 30 of the large ensemble members, and you can see they all show a lot of warming, greater than global Arctic warming. In this particular case, the internal variability is a very small contribution to our uncertainty in the future climate trends. So that brings me back to this question of why the Arctic sea ice has declined, and what can we expect now and in the future that when we have these large ensembles. So here I just show a histogram of different trends in the large ensemble. In the black are the trends for the pre-industrial control run. So these show the trends that would be present in the absence of any anthropogenic forcing. In gray are the trends from the CESM large ensemble from 1979 to 2013. So again, you see a distribution of trends. They all decrease, their Arctic sea ice extent all decreases, but again, this wide range that results from internal climate variability. And then we have the observations in red. The observations are within the spread of the CESM large ensemble, emphasizing once again that this model can reproduce observed sea ice loss, but it does so with a large amount of variability. What's remarkable to me is how similar these results are to the Kay et al. 2011 GRL paper when we only had 6 ensemble members. There's no way I could make PDFs of 6 ensemble members. They just appeared as dots on the bottom. But yeah, the observed sea ice loss cannot be explained by natural variability alone. The observed trends are well outside of the black histogram, where we have the internal variability arising from natural forces alone. Individual climate model on simulations can reproduce the observed sea ice loss. Faster than forecast, in my mind, is dead. We shouldn't be talking about it anymore. And then finally, observed Arctic sea ice loss has potentially been enhanced by internal variability. And you can just do a back of the envelope calculation where, again, you take the mean trend in the large ensemble, which gives you an estimate of the forced response, and compare that to the observed trend. And that gives you a sense that maybe what we've observed is on the more extreme end of what it could have been. And recent papers have come out that really outline the atmospheric circulation mechanisms that underlie that and show that this is very consistent with the observed trends in atmospheric circulation within the large ensemble. So when asked when the Arctic will become ice-free, we need to really be careful about how we communicate this. We need to say something like, it'll happen in the middle of this century. Internal climate variability really limits the predictability of an ice-free Arctic Ocean. So this is a paper by Alexandra Yan, who's a professor at CU, just plotting all of the different large ensemble members with the observations. You get this sense that the ensemble is representing the observed ice loss, but that the observed ice loss is perhaps on the more extreme side. But also you get this sense that when this model goes ice-free is very unpredictable. There's about a 2-decade uncertainty in that. So if somebody tells you that the Arctic sea ice is going to go ice-free on September 28th, 2042 at 15:20, that's just not possible. We don't have that level of precision. We need to say the middle of this century. And we need to continue to investigate the processes, the physics in this model as well, but knowing that this internal climate variability is really going to limit predictability. So this is the slide I showed at the beginning of the talk, just showing the Arctic sea ice extent from one climate model simulation here. I'm identifying which one it is. It's member 38 from the CESM large ensemble. And you can see the observed ice loss well predicted by this ensemble member. And you see this trajectory down towards an increasing ice-free Arctic Ocean. You see there's some bounces along the way, but it's pretty much just a slow decline, and in fact a pretty fast decline, into an ice-free state. But it's important to recognize that it could equally look like this. This is ensemble member 13. Again, the only reason it differs from the previous graph is due to the internal climate variability in the system. So here we see the observed sea ice loss pretty well matched, and then we see this increase for over a decade in the ice extent. It goes, from reaching a barrel minimum of 4 million square kilometers, goes up to 6 million square kilometers. And then in 5 years, it drops from 6 million square kilometers to 1 million square kilometers. This is totally possible, and it's something we need to prepare for and communicate about. The internal climate variability can overwhelm the forced response, but the forced response is still very much there. So I'm almost at the end, and I want to thank so many people. It's really been an amazing experience to launch a career in the 21st century in climate science. Coupled with the science is a real obligation to advance it and communicate as the world warms. And here I just have the pictures of some, not all, of the folks who I've worked with and have been particularly influential to me. I want to particularly call out my group, which is on the upper right. Again, this year has been an incredible year for us, with 3 PhDs graduating and going off into the world. They've all done so well, and I'm incredibly proud of them. I want to leave you, instead of with a scientific summary, with something that's more general, some advice for advancing science in the 21st century as the world warms. First, I think we need to ask and answer important scientific questions. I'm often guided by the metric of watts per meter squared. If something is important, it has a pretty large watts per meter squared. It has a signal that we might observe. It's something that is really important for our future and for understanding our existence on the planet. It's so important to use all the tools that we have available, and that includes both models and observations. Together, they enable us to make discoveries. So often I hear people say, I'm an observationalist, or I'm a modeler. I don't think that this is the way that we go forward. I think we need to work together and not be in these little siphoned, tool-based ways of thinking about the world. We really need to think about using both models and observations together. We need to keep our deterministic views in check. And this is particularly important after seeing just how much internal climate variability can overwhelm the forced response, especially on short timescales, but even out to a couple of decades. And this is going to be a challenge to communicate. It's a challenge to communicate within our own discipline. It's even more challenging if we go beyond our scientific realm. I think we really need to confront the communication and education challenge. So we need to communicate with each other, with the public, with everyone. This is a really serious issue, what's happening in the Arctic. It's not just sea ice, there's also Greenland, which of course affects global sea level rise. And there's the education component of it too. We need to have the next generation of scientists be available and be around, and that requires us taking the time to really make sure they know and understand what's happening and can contribute and communicate it as well. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, to work with passionate colleagues all over the globe who inspire, enable, and support you. I cannot emphasize how important this has been in my career. There's always people that are going to be frustrating or hard to work with, and you don't always need to work with them. Find some other people to work with. There's plenty of inspiring and enable and supporting people out there, and I'm so pleased to have worked with so many of them. So with that, I will thank you.
So we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions, but before we do that, can I get Alan here to take a picture of...
Sure, yeah.
Oh, great.
If you insist.
Should we get down here?
Sure.
We can get down here. Okay, so I have a microphone which I'm going to ask you guys to speak to so that everybody can hear what's going on.
Any questions?
I don't know if I'm supposed to wait for the microphone or not. I can speak pretty loudly.
I'll repeat it.
Okay. So how do you know that the magnitude of the internal variability of the model is accurate?
This is an excellent question. How do you know that the internal climate variability within the model is accurate? This is something that we call out specifically in our BAMS paper about the large ensemble, the importance of looking at that. And in fact, after this lecture, I'm going to go to a lunch where we're discussing that exact thing, because this large ensemble concept has caught on all over the world, and now modeling centers are running these types of experiments all over the world. And what they're seeing is that while internal climate variability is large, the character of it varies from model to model. And so there's a real need to understand what are the processes that are underlying it, and are they reasonable in the model. For the Arctic sea ice example, I know, for example, in the CESM large ensemble, the variability in the North Pacific sea level pressure is greater than what we've observed. There's more sea level pressure variability there than in the records that we already have. So that makes me want to think about, well, what kind of influence would that variability have, for example, on Arctic sea ice trends? I think it's important to emphasize also that these types of experiments have really only come on the scene in the last 3 to 5 years. So there's a lot of questions left. And that's, I think, the one you raise is a very important one.
Great.
So Jen, excellent talk. One of the issues you raised is at the end of the century, the forced response takes over. And that's actually something I think educationally we need to kind of highlight, that it does, the future's our choice regardless of all of this. But is there something you can say about the transition between the internal variability and that forced response in the Arctic? Or what should we be communicating about that message, I guess is the question.
I think the question of when the internal variability gets swamped by the forcing is a really important one. But in order to understand the answer to that question, you need to know both the signal, how big is the forced response, how much CO2 are you talking about, and also how big is the variability, because in this, that's the noise, right? And that was the very first question that we had. So I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm saying that these types of experiments really, they change the way that we think about the climate system on 20, 30-year timescales. And this concept of faster than forecasts becomes hard to reconcile when you have so much internal climate variability, right? I mean, the faster than forecast figures, they have the mean and the standard deviation. They don't show the individual ensemble members, and yet nature is just one ensemble member that's happening. So it really calls into question just how we're looking at these and how we're thinking about them, and the importance of understanding both that signal from the increased greenhouse gases and the noise from the variability.
Jen, is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, even before the decline of Arctic sea ice started, so back in the 60s and 70s, the summertime cloud cover was very high. The famous Arctic summer stratus, like 80 to 90 north, it was 80 to 90% cloud cover. So it seems like it was close to your cloudy end member. Then would it be fair to say that random variations would be more likely to have a reduction in summer cloud cover than an increase?
I think so. One of the things about the 2007 sea ice loss that I want to emphasize is that even though 2007 was a less cloudy year in the Arctic, the cloud amounts, the cloud occurrence was still 70%. It's still a pretty cloudy place. Yeah, but I agree with you that the variability in cloud cover is going to express itself on the system by influencing how much shortwave radiation makes through. But what's controlling that variability in cloud cover in the summer is the large-scale atmospheric circulation. It's not the surface itself.
Hi, Jen. Congratulations. Great talk. So coming back to the first question of how much of the variability is represented, do you think that that the ensemble samples ocean variability enough, or is there still a memory of the ocean state where it was initialized?
That's a great question. So I just emphasized the large ensemble, the sort of base experiments. There's been a number of offshoot experiments from this. Too many for me to describe here. Fixed aerosols, different ocean initial conditions is one of them. And what they saw was that by the time they get to the 1960s, 70s, the memory of the initial condition in the ocean is no longer seen. Hu Kim has a nice paper about that I can send to you. But I think one of the nice things about this large ensemble framework is, and Paul Kushner emphasized this too, is that it's a complete characterization of a model. And as we get more and more of these offshoot experiments, it's an even more complete characterization of a model. I mean, it may be a totally wrong model, right? All models are wrong, but at least we understand all of these different processes within the context of a single model. And I think that's really important and something that hasn't been done before.
So Jen, is this, yeah. Okay. Thinking about these ensembles and internal variability a little bit more, I know there have been a lot of global climate model ensemble runs that have been done.
Right.
But I don't think that any of these ensembles have ever captured catastrophic transitions. For example, the collapse of an ice sheet, a major ice sheet, or Greenland, or the reversal of major ocean circulation. So do you think that, the models are obviously missing probably some either processes or source of internal variability that could be really critical?
Yes. Again, there's three sources of uncertainty. Internal climate variability is just one, and the one that I think we have the most ability to reduce is the physical process uncertainty. Land ice is exploding right now. Our ability to model it, our ability to incorporate it into these fully coupled models. I'm looking right here at Jan Lennartz, who's a new faculty member in my department, and that's his area of research. It's really wonderful to see this addition of, for example, the ability to try to look at Greenland surface mass balance, to try to couple oceans with ice shelves and do it in the context of a fully coupled model. These are really challenging problems for science right now, and they have really a lot of importance in what we do in the future. They all will be influenced by internal climate variability as well, so we have to keep that in our mind. But I agree with you that there's some really important physics that we're still working to put in the models and understand that impact on the climate system. Yeah.
So congrats again, and thanks for the sort of an illuminative talk. So let me change it more to a policy-relevant debates. Oops, sorry. So 2040 to 2070 is not that far away. Into 2040 to 2070, that window is not that far away. Arctic is existential crisis for the species there, as was Africa, as was India. So my question really is, if we envision a world in 2040 without sea ice, there are other feedbacks, including oil and gas exploration. How will it transform? We're human beings, so we've seen it in the past in other areas, Arctic is special. And how should we be translating that to the community?
So I want to make one really important point about Arctic sea ice. It's extremely responsive. So if we decided today to start reducing CO2, the sea ice would come back. The time scale for it is 5-10 years. So although I share your concerns about the future of an ice-free Arctic, I also don't want to make it sound like that's inevitable. We still control that future decision, and it arises from the uncertainty in future decisions that we make as a species, right? In terms of concerns about the increasingly Arctic-free ocean and what it means for shipping, for geopolitical, for species, the only thing that I guess I particularly can comment on is polar bears, because I've actually spent some time in the Arctic with Polar Bears International, which is the world's leading polar bear conservation organization. I've done a lot of education and outreach with them as a part of my NSF Career Award. I'm actually wearing this hand sensor. You guys probably didn't see. You probably thought I was just wearing a Fitbit. It's measuring my skin conductance to see how engaged I am. I'm pretty engaged, I think. So we're doing education and outreach with them, with Polar Bears International, and I would say talking to polar bear biologists who worked in the Arctic in the early 1980s till today, they're seeing firsthand the influence of climate change on polar bears. And we could talk about whether or not polar bears are, the appropriate icon, or if they're concerned, that's what we really should be talking about. But I know that they get a lot of impact. When I have been up there doing educational programming with them, we've had 40,000 people tuning in to watch the bears and talk about climate change and sea ice loss. And usually those people are teachers with an entire classroom behind them. So I think this context of the changing Arctic and its influence, we're doing our best to communicate it. It's definitely not entirely out there, and I don't know all of the dimensions of what's going to happen by the middle part of this century. You're asking me to ask what's going to happen in Russia. I think Russia is going to expand their economy into the Arctic, right? More than 10% of their economy is there. I think for the US, it's more like 2%. So yeah, there's a lot of decisions to be made.
I know there are more questions that want to be asked, but they'll have to take place in the break. We have one last question that is very short.
Thank you. So my question is, how large is a large ensemble project? How do you decide it's forte before when you design an experiment?
So I'll give you a sense of how that was decided. So the previous supercomputer was a factor of 30 smaller. So basically, our supercomputer increased by a factor of 30. We had just completed our CMIP-5 simulations, so we were kind of off the hook. There was a lot of model development going on. And somebody gave us a computer that was 30 times faster. So in some ways, that guided it. We tried to get up above 40 because 40 is often, enough to make a distribution. And we thought, okay, it's really going to depend on the question, how many ensemble members you need, right? For global mean temperature, obviously 40 is overkill. For extreme events, I'm not sure 40 is enough. So continuing to think about that interaction between the question you're asking and how many members you need, I think is something that we're just beginning to quantify now. Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions, and join me in congratulating Jen again.
Thanks for coming.